Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast about your Kindle books and all things Amazon. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is May 3rd, 2019. Greetings from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we have just had a few glimpses of the sun in this past week, but there was a good deal of light and joy last weekend when 4 generations of our family celebrated my mother's 90th birthday just west of here. Born on April 29th, 1929, the year of the Great Crash, my mother Lois has been a painter, an author, a home builder, and someone always ready to encourage members of her family to take risks in creating something new. You'll see that's a connection with my guest for this episode, Austin Kleon. So Mom was the one who, when I was about 8 years old, convinced me that our neighborhood in Wayland, Massachusetts, needed a really local newspaper. Thus began the Clay Pit Flyer, which I wrote, edited, and delivered on my bicycle each week for 2 cents a copy. It was a fairly straight line from that project, editing my high school newspaper, serving on the news board of the Harvard Crimson, reporting for newspapers in Rhode Island and Wyoming, and yes, maybe the creation 10 years ago of this podcast. In fact, it may be that my mother has inspired this 561st episode of the show, which will be an experiment based on a just-published book by Austin Kleon titled Keep Going, 10 Ways to Stay Creative in Good Times and Bad. You may remember that Austin was my guest on TKC 555 in March, and before Darlene and I left Denver 2 weeks ago, he stopped by the Tattered cover in Denver on his many stops book tour. We were there, and he gave me permission to record the session attended by about 100 people. When I interview an author for the show, I always try to give him or her maximum opportunity to tell their story with my questions designed as light guides for conversation. Since I've already recorded that kind of a conversation with Austin, I had the idea to create what I think of as an asynchronous back and forth or an asynchronous dialogue that will give me the chance for longer responses to some of the points that interested me most in his presentation. So what you will hear this week are excerpts from that Tattered cover talk, each followed by what I might have said if Austin and I were chatting at length in the store's nice coffee shop. Before that, I've got some Amazon news and a tech tip. Let's jump in. Listener Max Baston, who's from Colorado, I think someone else also tipped me off to this CNBC story reporting that Amazon is creating 400 jobs in our Denver neighborhood known as Lower Downtown or LoDo. The company has already created more than 3,500 jobs in Colorado since 2016. A press release dated April 30th stated that Amazon will now open a new 98,000 square foot office in LoDo, and that will allow it to more than double its tech workforce in the Denver area. Now, those other jobs, the rest of the 3,500, are in customer fulfillment, retail facilities such as Whole Foods. There's some fulfillment centers in the area. So they're talking about a doubling of the actual high-tech jobs. I like how Dave Wood, the Amazon executive quoted in the release, described the advantages of our neighborhood. Quote, "Our new office will offer our teams the convenience of a downtown location with an array of outdoor adventures just up the road." No one mentioned HQ2 in this announcement. Denver, as you may remember, was one of the top 20 finalists in the competition, but that's old news at this point. If I were a few decades younger, I think I might have my name in for one of these new positions in software and hardware engineering, cloud computing, and advertising that be available just a few blocks from where Darlene and I have our condo in downtown Denver. Sometime when they're up and running, maybe I'll have a chance to take a tour of the site there. For the tech tip, Steve Lehos emailed me a helpful tip about the latest Kindle firmware update. That's 5.11.1.1. These come through automatically. You don't really have to mess with them. If you want to, you can download them manually, and I'll have a link in the show notes on where you can find the information to do that. Steve writes, quoting from the information from Amazon, you can now install your favorite fonts on your Kindle and choose one of them to read your ebooks. There's quite a number of steps to do this. You have to do different files sometimes for regular, italic, bold. This is not a trivial process to do, but it might be, especially if you have a font that you need to read because it makes it easier for you to overcome some kind of a challenge you have for your reading. This might be worth doing. I find that there are plenty of good fonts to choose from. I always just set it to Bookerly. I think that's a nice font for reading. But there is now this ability to do a custom font if that's something that would interest you. Thanks to Steve for sending that along. Well, let's head over to the Tattered cover. Darlene and I took the bus to the store on Colfax Avenue for the reading or the presentation by Austin Kleon. To sketch a little of the scene there, we went downstairs into kind of a lower level, nice wall-to-wall green carpeting, a very pleasant room, of course, surrounded by bookshelves with books and a pretty bookish audience there. I think most of the people there were familiar with Austin's work. It seemed like it was, and he's had, this is the third of a series of books he's written about making art, so a very friendly audience. And his way of talking to us was very understated, and it reminded me that when I first heard Austin Kleon, which was probably about 3 years ago at South by Southwest in Austin, I had the same feeling that this guy is talking in a way as if he's just almost talking to himself or maybe a friend, and there were 1,000 people there in the big ballroom. He was one of the people who drew quite an audience when I listened to him down there, and this was probably after the first book, Steal Like an Artist, came out. So his affect when he does a presentation like this is consistent, whether it's 100 people or 1,000 people. It's not in any way designed to make you like him. That may be an awkward way of saying it, but it's not an ingratiating tone, and it's not a crusading tone or an evangelizing tone. It's simply kind of an offhanded sharing of things that he has picked up along the way. When I think about it, I recall one of the presentations when I was studying poetry at Bennington for my MFA. There was a poet named Robert Creeley, who I think has since passed on, and he gave a talk in a big auditorium there, probably talking about his poetry, similar kind of a thing, almost a craft talk, and it was so understated and quiet. You had the whole room was totally quiet just to try to listen to what he was saying. And there was a quality of it that was authentic, that was real, that was almost private, but it was in a public setting. And I've never forgotten it. That was like 12 years ago. And in some ways, I can relate that to the way Austin Kleon was talking to us, a much younger man. I think he's probably in his 30s, late 30s. And Creeley at the time was probably close to 80, I would guess. But that's kind of the setting. I think you'll hear it in these clips. Now, what I've done to get to this point, where I have 15 clips, most of them quite short, I've been listening to this recording I made probably 2 or 3 times. I've been driving around listening to it in the car, and I've listened to it I think I listened to it on the plane when we were flying out here. So I've really immersed myself in what he had to say about his latest book at the Tattered cover. And I've just been trying to pick out the things that made me think, or that made me smile, or that challenged me, motivated me to make some changes in my own life and in my art. And these are the ones that I've queued up here. And I haven't actually planned what I'm going to say about each of them, so I'm going to have this fiction that I'm sitting down with Austin in the coffee shop, and he's saying a few things, and I'm saying a few things afterwards. So this may be the first and only asynchronous interview that we're going to do, but why not? Let's try an innovation here. So we'll start with an overview of the latest book that he had toward the beginning of his talk, and we'll be moving through chronologically through the talk with my comments on each little snippet.
Keep Going is a book about how to kind of stay on the path. So Keep Going is about how to stay creative in good times and bad times. And basically a couple of years, like a lot of my peers, I sort of just felt like I'd wake up every morning and the world had got dumber and meaner overnight. I'd check my phone and the world was on fire. And in the meantime, I sort of felt like I wasn't sure what the point of creative work was in a world that's so chaotic. And so I sort of kind of lost my own path. And so the 10 points in Keep Going are things that I sort of figured out for myself over a couple of years. And a lot of them are stole from other artists that I admire. And now I'm putting them in this book and putting them out in the world because I think they might help others. So I think if I had to summarize Keep Going in a sentence, I would say that the creative life requires that you just hang in there, basically, that you just stick around and keep doing your work, because that's the way to get where you're going.
When you describe your new book that way, Austin, it explains to me why it has had such an impact on me. I, of course, read it before we talked for the interview, but I've kept reading it, and I keep turning to the physical version of the book in the mornings, and I'm devoting this whole new show to it. I think maybe I've kind of lost my path this year, maybe starting late last year into this year, as I've had 10 years of the podcast. I'm coming up on 11 years. Sometimes doing the podcast in the midst of everything that's going on in the world and in the midst of the changes in my life, and my parents are getting older. There's a lot of family things to tend to these days, and every week I climb Podcast Mountain and put this show together. So when you talk about the period in your life where you were kind of casting about, and that's what led to writing this book as a way to figure out how to keep going yourself, I can relate to it. So I think some of my appreciation of both the book and what you're saying here at the Tattered cover has to do with the point in my life when I came across it. And that's pretty much how books have always affected me in the past. As a certain book hits it during a certain time of life, and all of a sudden it seems to be somewhat essential.
So if you haven't seen Groundhog Day, Bill Murray plays a weatherman who wakes up every day and he relives the same day, February 2nd, Groundhog Day. And he gets stuck in this time loop. And he lives this day over and over again. And at one point he turns to a couple of drunks in the bar and he says, "Well, what would you do if you were stuck in one place and every day was exactly the same and nothing that you did mattered?" And one of the drunks looks at him and says, "Oh, that about sums it up for me." Right? We all sort of feel this way sometimes, right? I know I do. I think how you answer this question is your art.
I like how big this makes the topic of art and what it is. Feeling stuck and feeling as if nothing matters. That's the situation that Phil is in Groundhog Day, played so brilliantly by Bill Murray. And if I think of this period of my life and other periods in my life when perhaps I felt stuck, I felt like, I'm doing things and they don't seem to matter in making anything boldly new or improving things. I seem to be kind of repeating errors that I've been making for years in my relationships and just how I go about my day, not stopping to smell the flowers, working too hard, whatever. So the idea that the answer to those questions, it might be therapy, it might be a lot of different things to answer that, but the idea of answering it with your art, and by that I think I can take your creativity, the things that I'm creating, are the answer to that question, and that puts it in a fresh light, or at least a way that made me think about it when you mentioned it, and it's in the book as well as in your comments here. What is it that I'm creating that really is a counterweight to the times when I feel stuck and that nothing matters? What is it? The interviews? Is it the learning about the Kindle? Is it the books? Just the love of reading and sharing it with people? Is it capturing my thoughts and feelings in words and expressing them clearly? Is it learning microphones? All the stuff. All of these things would, if I was to elevate what I'm doing here to an art form, this is my paints and my palette, or my blank pieces of paper and my pens. All of this goes into the project of creating a conversation with people who I can't see every week and doing it for 10 years. So there's a clue there, and I think that following this conversation and these snippets is leading me on a journey to ask that question that the guys were asking in the bar, and then saying, okay, if the answer is my art, what do I need to be doing differently about my art?
Groundhog Day is this sort of modern parable that a lot of different people have attached themselves to it, but I think it has particular relevance to creative people because sort of no matter where you are in the process of your creative life, this one question sort of hangs over you, whether you just got started or whether you just won a Pulitzer or an Oscar or whatever. And that question is, what's next? Right? The creative person always has to figure out what's next. What's the next step? And the people who have this figured out and manage to sustain a long creative career, I think, are the people who have some sort of daily practice. So they're the people that they show up every day no matter what, and they do their work. So they don't worry too much about success or failure, because if they're facing failure, it doesn't matter, because they know they're going to get up tomorrow and do the work. The thing that Phil figures out in the movie is that repetition is a gift. He gets to learn things, he gets to practice, and every day he decides is a sort of gift so that he can get better.
I like that. Repetition is a gift, and always the question is, what's next? In this project, what's next is always the next week's show. This translates into slightly different disciplines depending on the day of the week, Monday and Tuesday, kind of gathering things, maybe doing the interview, Thursday editing, Friday putting it together. At the same time, I have had a daily practice largely around my journaling. I've kept journals since way back to probably when I was putting the Clay Pit Flyer out in Wayland. And that's a time of writing in a personal way, not quite as purposeful as the journaling or the diary writing that Austin talks about, which then ends up going into blog posts and then his newsletter and then the books. But showing up each day with the desire to sense what the day's about, what matters, to go back to that other question, that's something to it. The repetition of doing the show, there really is genius in that. Similar, and I've always loved Groundhog Day, that movie. I have a bit of a strain in that I really love doing things over and over, and almost to the point of obsession. But in doing over 500 shows and just all the details of how it goes together and slight improvements of it, and then possibly coming on a time when I might recast the mission here or think about different ways to spend 45 minutes engaging with these topics which are of interest to me and I hope are of interest to you who are listening. What's next? Good question. Well, the next snippet is a quote from Joseph Campbell, another favorite author of mine, talking about the bliss station and his description of it as an important element in an artist's work.
You must have a room or a certain hour or so a day where you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning. You don't know who your friends are. You don't know what you owe anybody. You don't know what anybody owes you. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. This is the place of creative incubation. At first you may find that nothing happens there, but if you have a sacred space and use it, eventually something will happen.
My experience of the bliss station is a little bit the way, Austin, you were talking about the difficulty of doing this when you're on the road, going to 26 different readings for your book, because when we migrate from Denver to Cambridge to Maine and occasionally travel elsewhere, I'm always having to recreate the place where I have that connection with myself and my writing or working on the show or whatever. And I find that it's very possible to do it. I basically need a desk. It can be at a Comfort Inn motel. If there's a cup of coffee, that's part of it. And sort of arranging the altar of my writing. There's coffee, and then there's music. I have an Amazon tap, or I have some way to play some music as I'm working. And if I have all those things, I don't exactly light candles, but arranging those things sets me up for a bliss station of one kind or another. I do feel challenged by the way that you talk about keeping everything away from the bliss station. And I have a bad habit sometimes. I've been trying to break it lately of, I get out of bed, I check my iPhone, I see what the news is, and decide, how outraged to be at 7 in the morning. I'm trying to wait till noon. No news till noon is my mantra that I'm trying to live by. And having the place where I show up as a creative person be not only that, not checking Twitter and, of course, those kinds of things, but settling into some deeper sense of the possibilities. I have come up with a really fruitful mini bliss station, is one way to look at it. Starting right at the beginning of the year, I had the thought that I would do 10-minute times of meditation during the day, not on any set schedule and not with all the kinds of discipline that I've used on meditation practice in the past. But I know when I'm sort of getting out of sorts. I maybe got back from some meeting that confused me or upset me, and that would be a time I would dive into Twitter and do a bunch of stuff. And instead, I tell Alexa to set a timer for 10 minutes, and the Echo clock does that nice countdown on the clock, and I just sit in the chair for 10 minutes. I'm not, in a formal Zazen posture. If there's a cup of coffee, I'll drink it. But I'm just stopping for 10 minutes. And depending on how wired up I am, that can seem like a really long time. I watch those first hashtags of the 10 minutes click by, and I think, can I really sit here for 10 minutes? There's things I need to be doing. And invariably, by the time it ticks down to the last minute, which is counted off by seconds on the clock, things have settled. If I'm a dirty glass of water, the dust has gone down to the bottom. And there are a few things that seem to need to be done. Edit the podcast, call that guy that might be a guest next week, reach out to my cousin in Austin to plan a trip. Just a few things that seem to beckon in the place where I'm just sitting. I'm not doing anything. I'm looking at the leaves out the windows here in Cambridge. And I've really come to trust that mechanism. I think it does relate to what you're talking about with the bliss station, that if you give yourself stillness and quiet and freedom from things which pretty much the whole rest of the day are running the show, you can be surprised by what arrives. And it has helped my work, and it's basically helping me get through the day these days, and I really value it. So I hadn't thought of it as a bliss station until I heard you talk about it and read about it in the book, but I think I have stumbled on a sort of very portable mini bliss station in these 10-minute times of sitting.
So we all like to think that if we could just change our circumstances, right, we'd be more creative. If I could just move to Paris, right? Rent a light-filled studio, maybe buy a beret, fall in with a gang of misfits, then I could really paint my masterpiece, right? But we know this is wishful thinking, that everything we need to make our good work is here. We just have to pay more attention to it.
Well, this one was a direct hit when you talk about moving to Paris. And I remember a time when Darlene and I were in France. We weren't in Paris. It was somewhere in south of France, and we were at a cafe, and I had my journal with me. I am embarrassed to say it's very possible I had a beret on, and I'm sitting there with a little cup of coffee, and it's sunny, and it's outside, and I'm surrounded by, French people, and I'm hearing French, and I'm kind of understanding the French, and I'm writing in my journal, and I'm basically writing something to the effect of, I'm here at a coffee shop in France, and I'm writing in my journal, and I've never been happier. And so it was this sense that, I had left Denver or Casper or wherever we were living at the time, and now I'm in this place where everything is different, and I'm different, and all of a sudden I'm an artist. And I wasn't actually creating any significant art. I was writing in my journal just the way I do everywhere else, but it was all the prompts of the props of sitting at that cafe. And his point that he builds on that is not just to mock that delusion, which, that's relatively harmless to imagine these things and derive some pleasure from them. And I really did enjoy that coffee shop, so I'm not going to take that away from myself. But the point is that if you are seriously going to create things which last and touch other people, you're going to find them right where you are, in the backyard here in Cambridge, or looking out on the city streets in Denver, wherever we are. Paying attention is what turns those ordinary things into something extraordinary. And the other activity that I don't have as much time to do these days because of the podcast and other commitments is writing. And when I've had a chance, when I was writing regular posts at Medium, to spend some time babysitting with Ryan and Jake next door, the 3-year-old and the 5-year-old now, and then taking some time afterward to write about it, write an essay, have a photo. What was it like to have Ryan in my lap and read him a story, and to actually get it onto a page. I enjoyed doing it. It's difficult. I had some nice reactions to it. And now when I go back and I read those pieces, I just love them. I thought, oh gosh, this is really pretty good. So I have experienced both the foolishness of thinking that going to Paris is going to change everything, and the satisfaction of paying attention, unusual attention, better than average attention to ordinary things, and seeing what comes of it. I think this is one of the best points that you've made in the book and also in this conversation.
The world doesn't necessarily need better artists. It needs better human beings. And so if making your art is making you less of a good human being, I'm not sure it's worth making. And if art is ruining your life, or it's ruining the people around you's life, I think it's time to do something else, because I think that art is for life and not the other way around. So we need more better human beings, not necessarily more artists.
Now you're scratching a place that runs pretty deep in my life and has a fair amount of regret to it, because as I was in my 30s, early 30s, I was quite consumed with the ambition to be an artist. And at that time, it was to be a writer. And there were other issues involved, but much of my decision and the choices that I made with my ex-wife, it was a joint venture. It resulted in the end of my first marriage after 11 years when my daughters were very young. And if I had heard this admonition that we need better humans, not better artists, I would not have been able to hear it. I thought there's nothing more important than being an artist. And I was reading Thoreau, and, most men lead lives of quiet desperation. I was all wrapped up in that stuff. And the years went by, and there's been a lot of healing after the divorce, and now my daughters have got children of their own, and the long arc of the family being restored, or my role in the family being restored, largely through decades of sobriety. But I think this is absolutely an important point, and maybe it's a point that you can't see when you're in your 20s and you're full of ambition for your art or your career, whatever your creativity is taking you to. But as you get up toward, your late 60s, like I am, this one is true, and it can be applied now just as it could have been applied in my life 40 years ago. It's like the old saying, there's two good times to plant a tree, 40 years ago and today. And anytime I can set the part of my life that I consider art in its right place with how I am living as a husband and a father and a grandfather and a son and a brother, that's when I have the mix right. And I think this is well said.
If you're on Twitter, you're scrolling through and you're like, good Lord, the world is like on fire. This is not worth it's not worth living, right? This is crazy. But then you go outside and it's like, yeah, there's some craziness. There's some stuff that's wrong. but there's also like blue sky, and there's people outside, and there's your neighbors, right? You see people on the street. Like, life always seems worth living when you're outside taking a walk. Just took a walk through the city park before this. So I encourage you, next time you get bogged down, if you take one thing from tonight, get outside and take a walk. I think it's it solves a lot of things.
Austin, one of my favorite things that you talked about, both in the book and I think in our conversation as well, are the 3-mile walks that you take every morning with your wife and your 2 kids in a double stroller, and hearing how many things get resolved, talked about. 3 miles is a long way. That would be a long walk for me. I've got problem knees, and a mile walk is about my limit. When I've been talking with Darlene about what I'm doing here, I've shared that I'm going to have this conversation, asynchronous conversation with Austin based on his reading of the Tattered cover. She said gently, because she knew that I have become quite a fan of him, a lot of what he said just seemed to be cliches, things that are sort of obvious. And I know what she means, and this one here that we just heard about, the benefits of getting some fresh air, getting out, taking a walk, that would certainly fall into this category. Maybe what I'm experiencing here is, when the student is ready, the teacher appears, that when I've got some restlessness and some things that seem unresolved and kind of a way in my life these days, somebody says, hey, you ought to get outside more, you ought to go on walks. It seems brilliant. It seems like, wow, how come I never thought of that? And I know it's true. Darlene and I have gone on walks at low tide at Ocean Park, and those are always, wonderful conversations that are different than the conversations we have when we're sitting in the living room. So that's a true thing. And also getting offline. We haven't talked about that explicitly here, but the whole tension of what you can do online versus what you can do outdoors, and the things you can't do outdoors. You can look at your phone if you're a fool, but the opportunity is to just be out there and experience it. Platitudes, perhaps, but one person's platitude can be another person's breakthrough if it arrives at the right time and via the right messenger. Here is how Austin concluded the prepared portion of his remarks.
I'm going to leave you with this story about Virginia Woolf, the writer, and her husband Leonard. The years leading up to World War II were some of the worst in their lives, obviously. And Virginia and Leonard, they were big gardeners, actually, and they lived on this property, and they gardened a lot, and they took a lot of walks. But one thing that they did a lot of is they would listen to Hitler on the radio. Whenever Hitler would come on the radio, they would get around the radio and listen and be like, oh, what's that awful man saying now? And one day, Leonard was out in the orchard, and he was planting flowers. And Virginia, she threw open the window, and she said, not in a Texan accent, she said, Leonard, he's back on the radio again. Come in, you got to listen to him. And Leonard, he shouted back at her. He said, no, I'm not coming today. I'm planting flowers, and they'll be blooming long after he's dead. And sure enough, 21 years later, when Leonard Woolf wrote his memoirs, some of those flowers were still blooming, and Hitler was long gone. And so what I take from that is that, I want y'all to ask yourselves, what are you planting? What are you planting today that might turn into something beautiful tomorrow? Because I feel like every day we get a shot to kind of work on something, and we have to think about what kind of seeds we're planting for the future. And plant good seeds and hang in there and keep going. And I think that's the way to do it. So thanks for listening to me tonight.
Plant good seeds, hang in there, keep going. Again, a nice summary of this new book that Austin is touring and talking about and has just published, Keep Going. The seeds, what you plant now and what fruit they might bear in the future, that's a pretty cool thought. When you think back to the drunks in the bar saying, everything's always the same and nothing matters. Well, if you start something new, if you plant something, if you figure out some way to create something that has an arc toward the future. That's worth it, isn't it? He was really looking forward to getting to the Q&A, and I'll share a couple of those exchanges. You won't be able to hear the questions because they weren't passing around a mic, but I think you'll be able to tell what the questions were and what some of what his answers were. Two of the first questions had to do with the weekly newsletter that Austin Kleon puts out, and this goes to 60,000 people. It's free. You just sign up for it, and I've been getting it for probably years. It's really good. He when he explains how he puts it together, it helped me to understand why this is something which shows up in my inbox, which has a little more weight and a little more impact than a lot of the other things that show up.
Thanks for saying that. I did yesterday's in a hotel. I stayed up in that hotel room in Boulder last night and finished this morning. So, yeah, it's important to me too. Like the newsletter is, it's not just like a marketing thing for me. You know, like it's a way for me to kind of like look back on my week and sort of think about where I've been and what I wrote about, what I read, and what I looked at. So it's a meditative practice for me. So I'm thrilled that you get something out of it.
A lot of Austin's newsletter is recommending books that he has read, and this next questioner said that he estimates that half of the books he reads come from recommendations from Austin's newsletter, and that led him to ask, how does he manage to spend so much time reading?
I guess I'm just curious, like what percentage of your time is reading? Because clearly you're reading a massive amount of material on a regular basis.
Well, it's part of my job, so I always like to, I don't have a day job, like this is it, like this is my work now, so like a big part of being a writer for me is being a reader, so I do schedule like dedicated time to read, so I probably read, but I probably only read 2 hours a day, really, I mean, which doesn't seem like a lot to me since it's like such a crucial part of my gig, so, but I read a lot. I like go to bed like an hour before I want to fall asleep, basically. And I read then, and then I'll read in the afternoon. I usually read like nonfiction in the afternoon or in the morning, and then I read like fiction or comics or something to kind of get me knocked out at night. One thing that I was experimenting with for a while, though, is reading in the morning. I think if some of you are having trouble finding time to read, instead of reaching for your phone in the morning, like set your alarm and get up, 15, 20 minutes before you want to be up and read a little bit. I think like reading in the morning, it can be this kind of wonderful way to kind of ease into the day.
Toward the end of the question period, I felt a question rising on my lips and was a little nervous about bringing it up. And I'll say that it came out of my personal experience. Some of what's been going on with me since last year into this year has been dealing with depression. He uses the term clinical depression. I don't consider what I'm experiencing to be that sounds too intense compared to what I've been going through. But I've talked to my doctor about it, and I'm on some very light medication, which seems to be peeling back the darkness a bit. It had gotten to a point where it was of concern, and I knew there were tools to address it, and I'm glad I've been able to do them. But when I was thinking about keeping on and Austin's advice on how to keep being creative, I wondered if he ever suffered from depression himself, and if these taking walks and all the things he's talking about were enough to get him through real periods when everything just kind of stops because of depression, as opposed to just kind of the ups and downs of the creative life. So this next person asking the question is me. Do you have any experience with depression in your work, or seeing depression handled by other artists, and how they keep going through the cycles of depression that maybe they're suffering from?
Any depression I've experienced, I haven't really suffered from clinical depression. I know people have, of course. I think the best thing on depression is William Styron's Darkness Rising, I think is the name of that. Darkness. What's it called? Visible. Darkness Visible, yeah. And then I know Andrew Solomon did a book called The Noonday Demon, but I haven't read that. I've read his parroted book, which is great, called Far From the Tree. But that's sort of really, I think Allie Brosh writes really brilliantly about depression too. There's a book called Hyperbole and a Half, where she has 2 pieces about depression. I didn't really understand depression until I read those things. So I can't speak to that for certain. I get the blues, but I don't get I'm not clinically depressed. Yeah, so I just don't have any personal experience with that.
I'll have links in the show notes to those books that Austin mentioned. Darkness Visible, A Memoir of Madness. I have read that one by William Styron years ago, and I remember it being a powerful book that was helpful to me to read at the time. The others that he mentions are The Noonday Demon, An Atlas of Depression by Andrew Solomon, and then the one by Allie Brosh, Brosh, is Hyperbole and a Half, Unfortunate Situations, Flawed Coping Mechanisms, Mayhem, and Other Things That Happened. I've got an item in content I want to mention, and it's a book that is going to be published May 10th, titled Think Like Amazon, 50 and a Half Ideas to Become a Digital Leader. It's by John Rossman, and I came across an article that he wrote yesterday in Market Watch based on the book, or I think it's maybe one of the items in the book. And it caught my eye because it had a picture of a Fire phone. And, of course, I had a Fire phone back 5-6 years ago. And he writes crisply, and as well as I've seen anyone write, about how the Fire phone is an example of Amazon's ability to deal with failure as part of an innovative culture, and to actually have those moments of failure really define and strengthen the attitude of culture. So he worked at Amazon quite a while ago, I think maybe about 15 years ago, but a lot of the principles of Amazon, I think, have been sustained over that period of time. So the fact that he had an inside view at a period in the company makes him very interesting to read. I have reached out to his publicist, and I think there's a good chance we're going to be able to have him on the show sometime later this month or early next month. I'd like to close with a couple of comments that you sent me. The first comes from Shimon Schott in Poland. Hi, Len. It seems that the new features, highlighting and marking books as read, are being silently, through remote enabling, rolled out to Kindle users. I have the former but not the latter. Even rebooting my Kindle has not activated this feature yet. He's talking about sorting the books into ones that have been read and unread. This may be the first time Amazon has rolled out features this way to the Kindle, but this sort of A/B testing is no doubt used on their website often. Best, Shimon. I haven't seen that read or unread feature either. I have seen the highlighting changes, and I like them. I'm going to save till next week. I've got a good reaction from Nadine Laird to the Moby Scribe tablet. I loaned it to her, and she spent a lot of time testing it, and she's got some interesting observations from it, pros and cons and a summary. So you'll have that to look forward to next week. Neil Dixon wrote, Hello, Len. Thanks for your recent interview with someone from Amazon about the new basic Kindle, which I can't for the life of me find on your website. Maybe I imagined it. Anyway, I was dying to ask when, if Amazon would go in the e-textbook market to supply higher education institutions and libraries. Neil is talking about the episode, the one before last, and it was Alan Hughes, who was an executive from Amazon, that talked to us about the basic Kindle. I realized when I saw the post for that episode that I hadn't really identified that it was about the new Kindle. I just said that he was an HBS alum. I got distracted by the fact that he and I had gone to the same graduate school. So that's 2 episodes ago if you want to hear that. He continues, Neil continues, at my place of work, UK university library, about 26,000 students. I recently was involved in testing demos for 2 different products by suppliers who provide textbooks for libraries. The suppliers, Cortex and Bibliotech, have an online reader and various Windows, Android, iOS apps. To be honest, both products were not fit for purpose. Their accessibility features were non-existent, and the various features such as note-taking and bookmarking were not much better than a basic website. I would be embarrassed to give these products to students as a print book is easier to use. Given this, I was thinking how this market would be so easy for Amazon. They could provide Kindles at discount prices and negotiate ebook licenses with the big publishers. Meanwhile, Amazon have students in their ecosystem and have all the data on how students use textbooks. The suppliers above are just aggregators, and Bibliotech bills themselves as the Netflix for textbooks. This is prime material for Amazon to take over. Anyway, bit of a random rant, but your interview review got me thinking. Please keep up the excellent work on the show. Thanks, Neil. I forwarded Neil's email to some folks at Amazon to see if we can get a little more information about what Amazon is doing in the e-textbook market. The Kindle DX about 10 years ago, or maybe less, I know that was designed for use in universities, and they had some pilot projects. Amazon has distributed some Kindles at a school in Florida that we talked about 10 years ago. So there have been efforts in this area, but there really hasn't been a sense that a killer app or a killer use for ebook technology has been launched by Amazon or anyone else. And my niece, Sarah Rock, confirmed that when we talked to her last week. But I think that there are things going on that it would be good to know about, so I hope that we're going to hear back from Amazon about that. That's it for this week. Next week's guest will be Tim Carmody, a tech writer who in January launched a high-quality newsletter named The Amazon Chronicles. Tim has unfortunately been forced to take a hiatus from the project due to health issues. He had a shoulder replacement that's caused a lot of pain, but I hope he's going to be able to return at full strength later this year. Meanwhile, I reached out to him, and he has agreed to talk with me next week about some of the stories that he's been covering about Amazon so far this year. It's been a while since I've had a chance to drive our Tesla Model 3 here in Cambridge while we were in Denver, so I have done some driving since we got back this week, and I've posted a new episode of my Edge of the Road podcast to let you know how things are going with Tess as we approach the 1-year mark of ownership. And you'll find that at theedgeoftheroad.com and at fine podcast directories everywhere. I haven't posted to the Edgecast podcast lately either, but that's on my list to add to some of those conversations. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to my show. I hope Austin Kleon is doing well on his book tour. He gets back to visit with his family in between, and I feel a lot of gratitude for the work he put into that book and the chance to not only talk to him here on the show, but also have a second chance to engage with him at the Tattered cover, and hope it's been helpful to you as well. Have a great day. Bye.